The wind moved like a whisper across the plains, stirring the tall grass into a slow, silver tide. Dust rose in soft ghosts beneath the hooves of a distant horse. Evening gathered its colors, rust, amber and bruised violet, over the horizon, and the world seemed to pause as if holding its breath for something it could not yet name. Somewhere between shadow and silence, a woman crouched behind a collapsed barn wall, her shawl clutched tight against her shoulders. Her name was Nita. The earth beneath her palms felt cool, almost kind, as if it had been waiting for her. Her lungs burned with exhaustion, but her fear was louder than pain. Each gust of wind sounded like footsteps. She had been running since the moon was high, guided by nothing but its pale light and the small, stubborn hope that somewhere beyond the ridge, someone might forget to be cruel. She could still hear the echo of her mother-in-law's voice, sharp as splintered glass, calling her barren, worthless, cursed. She could still feel Cole's hand slamming the table, smell the sting of laudanum on his breath, see the way he looked through her, as though her existence offended the air itself. There had been no tenderness in that house, only duty twisted into punishment. When the house went quiet each night, Nita would sit by the window, eyes fixed on the fields beyond, the moonlight spilling like milk across the furrows. She would imagine walking out and never stopping. The thought alone was dangerous, but it kept her heart alive in a place determined to crush it. Then one night, when the insults became prayers for her death, she stopped imagining. She waited for the house to sleep, packed what little she owned, a small pouch of herbs, a folded scrap of cloth embroidered by her late mother, and stepped into the dark. Now, hours later, she sat shivering in an unfamiliar field, her breath turning white in the early dawn. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorted. A door creaked open. She froze. Boots scraped against wood, slow and unhurried. The sound drew closer until it stopped just beyond the ruined wall. For a long moment, there was only silence, and then a voice, low and steady, with a trace of roughness that came from years of dust and solitude. "You hiding from the cold?" the man said, "or from something worse?" Nita didn't answer. She pulled her shawl tighter, heart thundering in her chest. The man stepped into view. He was tall, shoulders broad beneath a faded duster, a weak stubble shadowing his jaw. His eyes, though, were what disarmed her, clear, steady, and tired in a way that felt familiar. "I'm not here to drive you off," he said. "You can rest if you need." She studied him for a moment longer. The man carried no weapon but a lasso looped at his belt, his hands open, palms visible. He moved like someone used to quiet, deliberate, patient, aware that suddenness frightened small things. "I'll be gone by night," she managed, voice cracked from thirst. He nodded toward the barn. "Then at least take water before you go." He left a tin cup by the trough and stepped back, far enough to let her decide. She hesitated, then crawled forward, the earth rough beneath her knees. The water was cool and clean. She drank until her throat stopped aching. When she looked up, he was leaning against a post, watching her without judgment. "Name's Talon Mercer," he said after a while. "This land's mine, though most days it feels like it belongs to the wind more than me." She whispered her name, Nita, and looked away quickly as if speaking it aloud might summon the past she'd fled. He didn't ask where she came from or who she ran from. He only nodded once and gestured toward the barn's open door. "There's straw in there if you're looking for rest. I'll be at the house." When he left, the air felt strangely lighter. For the first time in months, she slept without dreaming. By morning, sunlight poured through the cracks in the barn wall, gilding the dust that danced in the air. Nita woke to the sound of a kettle whistling. She followed the smell of coffee to the small cabin a short distance away. Talon was sitting at a rough wooden table, his hat hanging on a peg beside the door. The room was simple, a bed neatly made, shelves of worn books, a rifle resting above the hearth, but it held a warmth the Branner house never had. He poured her a cup without speaking. She took it in both hands, letting the heat seep into her fingers. "You got folks looking for you?" he asked gently. "Not the kind worth finding," she replied. He gave a faint smile. "Then maybe let them keep looking." They ate in silence. Outside, the land stretched endless and open, the grass rippling like water under the wind. When she set the empty cup down, he looked at her and said simply, "Pack your things. You'll stay with me." Nita blinked. "Why?" "Because you look like you haven't been safe in a long time," he said. "And because I could use the company." There was no pity in his voice, only quiet certainty. Still, trust came slow to her. She followed him outside, unsure whether to stay or flee. He led her past the corral where a gray mare grazed, her coat glinting in the sun. "That's Whisper," he said. Doesn't take to many, but maybe she'll take to you. When Nita reached out, the horse turned her head and pressed her nose against Nita's palm. Talon laughed softly. Seems she's decided already. Days unfolded like gentle pages. Nita began helping with chores, feeding the animals, tending the small garden, mending clothes. She spoke little, but her silence no longer carried fear. Each evening they would sit on the porch and watch the sun sink behind the ridge. Sometimes Talon would hum old tunes under his breath, songs of cattle drives and lost rivers. Nita listened, her heart learning the shape of peace again. Talon never pried into her past, though he must have wondered. He carried his own silence, the kind built from grief rather than shame. Once she caught him staring at a locket he wore around his neck. Inside, she glimpsed a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes. He noticed her looking and closed it gently, saying nothing. The next day he taught her how to ride Whisper. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of the land became the rhythm of their lives. Morning light spilling through lace curtains. The scrape of boots by the door. Laughter, soft and unfamiliar, returning to her throat. Still, sometimes at dusk, she would see her reflection in the window and remember the woman she had been, small, unwanted, silent. But then she would feel Talon's hand brush hers as he passed, steady and warm, and the memory would dissolve like smoke. It was on a night heavy with rain that their silence broke. The wind howled against the windows and thunder rolled low across the hills. The roof leaked near the hearth, a thin trickle of water running down the wall. Talon rose to fix it, but she stopped him. "Let it be," she said. "It's just the sky crying a little." He smiled at that, a weary, gentle smile. Then after a pause he said quietly, "A woman deserves her name back, Nita. If you'll have mine." For a long moment neither spoke. The fire crackled, rain softened to a whisper. Then she nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll have it." They married the next morning under the open sky, with only the wind and a single blooming cactus as witness. No priest, no crowd, no promise carved into gold, only two hands joined in truth. When Talon slipped the ring onto her finger, the sun broke through the clouds as if blessing them. In the weeks that followed, life unfurled in color. Nita planted herbs by the window, their scent filling the small cabin. Talon carved a cradle from pine wood, though he said nothing of children. They did not speak of love often. It existed in the space between their words, in the way he handed her coffee each morning, in the way she waited at the gate each evening for his return. One morning, Nita felt a strange flutter in her belly, soft as a bird's wing. At first she dismissed it, but when it returned, steadier this time, she knew. She told Talon that night, her voice trembling between laughter and tears. He looked at her, stunned, and then his arms were around her, his body shaking with a joy he couldn't speak. The months that followed were quiet and golden. Talon became more careful with her, carrying the heavier loads, making her rest beneath the willow tree near the stream. The land seemed to soften too, grass greener, sky clearer, even the wind warmer. Still, some nights she lay awake, haunted by old words. Barren. Cursed. Useless. But when she placed Talon's hand against her growing belly, the shame that had once burned so fiercely turned to ash. When labor came, it came with a storm. Rain lashed the windows, lightning splitting the sky like judgment. The midwife arrived soaked, her shawl dripping, her face set with determination. Hours passed in cries and whispered prayers. Talon stayed by her side, his hand crushed in hers, his lips murmuring her name as though it alone could keep her tethered to the world. And then, at the edge of exhaustion, two cries broke through the storm. First a son's sharp wail, then a daughter's soft mewl. The midwife smiled through tears. "Twins," she said. "A boy and a girl." Talon laughed, a sound like sunlight breaking through thunder. But Nita's eyes fluttered closed, her face pale. He called her name once, twice, his voice cracking. The midwife pressed a hand to her wrist, waiting. Then Nita stirred, weak but breathing, and whispered, "We made it." Morning came bright and gold, washing the cabin in warmth. Nita opened her eyes to see Talon asleep beside the bed, his hand still gripping hers. The twins lay nestled against her chest, their tiny fingers curling and uncurling. She looked at them and thought of the barren fields of her past, the cruel words that had once rooted in her heart. Now all of it seemed far away, as if it had happened to someone else entirely. Outside, the world had changed. The land that had once been dry and cracked now shimmered with dew, wildflowers pushing through the soil as if answering her rebirth. She watched Talon stir awake, his eyes full of disbelief and love. "They'll have your eyes," she said softly. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. "Then they'll see the world kinder than it's ever been." Beyond the window, the plains stretched endless and forgiving, the wind carrying the scent of rain and new life. Nita closed her eyes, her heart steady, her spirit quiet at last. Somewhere deep within the whispering grass, the land itself seemed to sigh, as though it too had been waiting for her return. And for the first time the past no longer followed. It only watched from afar, fading like footprints in the dust. The story, it seemed, had only just begun.